right. We're jumping into a new mini section. We're looking at the mystical union, which is just who we are in Christ. So the mystical union with Christ is not what we see in some pantheistic religions. Pantheism, similar to New Age, thinks of us all as God or part of God. For example, in Buddhism, it holds that at death, we are like a drop of water returning to the ocean. So the individual ceases to exist, and you return to the all or to the total being. This is not what Christians believe in regard with our union with Christ. What we are talking about is the wonder of a personal relationship and identification of the regenerate believer with Jesus Christ, the creator and Lord of the universe. It is rather like the marriage relationship that Paul describes in Ephesians 5, where he says that the man and the woman become one flesh. By the way, I honestly believe that the biggest purpose of marriage is not procreation. I think that's a second. It's a high one, a second one. I think the biggest purpose of marriage was for God to provide an analogy of what we are with him, with Christ and the church. And we see that Paul uses that as an analogy of what we are, the two becoming one. Yet we still exist, or the married couple still exist as two individuals. It's not as though they somehow merge into one person. They're distinct persons, but they are so closely united that they become identified with one another as a unit. Often people will describe this as having a personal relationship with God, and sometimes this is attached to our emotional state. During our Christian walk, there are inevitably times when we feel closer to God, times where God feels distant, times where God feels silent or uncaring, but our union with Christ isn't dependent upon our experience or our circumstance, our emotion. Rather, our union with Christ is when we come into a relationship with Jesus and then stand and identify with him. And the feelings and circumstances don't change this fact. So the Bible has a lot to say about our union with Christ. So we want to look at some of the places. The first is we're going to look at a couple places in the Gospels where Jesus talks about this. First, let's look at John 15, verses 1 to 8. John 15, verses 1 to 8. Again, this is a very well-known passage about the vine and the vine dresser. John 15, starting in verse 1. I am the true vine, and my Father is the vine dresser. Every branch in me that does not bear fruit, he takes away. And every branch that does bear fruit, he prunes. We don't like that part so much. That it may bear more fruit. Already you are clean because of the word that I have spoken to you. Abide in me, and I in you. As the branch cannot bear fruit by itself unless it abides in the vine, neither can you. Unless you abide in me, I am the vine, you are the branches. Whoever abides in me, and I in him, he it is that bears much fruit. For apart from me, you can only do very little. Oh, sorry, did I misread that? Thank you. Apart from me, you can do nothing. If anyone does not abide in me, he is thrown away like a branch and withers. The branches are gathered and thrown into the fire and burned. If you abide in me and my words abide in you, ask whatever you wish, and it will be done for you. By this my Father is glorified, that you bear much fruit, and so prove to be my disciples. Here Jesus describes the relationship between himself and his disciples as being like the relationship between a vine and its branches. There is a deep union between the two. He says, abide in me and I in you. It is the person who is abiding in Christ and whom Christ is abiding, who is united with and unified with Christ, and therefore is a fruitful disciple. You cannot be united with Christ and not be fruitful. So in the parable of the vine and the branches, we have an illustration of this close union that the believers have with Christ. Not a union that takes away our individuality, but it's one that unites us intimately with Christ. And he is with us so that we become fruitful. And like I said, notice that the abiding in Christ produces fruit. Another example of our union with Christ is found in John 17, just a couple chapters further on. John 17, verses 20 to 23. This again is Jesus and his high priestly prayer. I do not ask for these only, but for those who will believe in me through their word. That's you and me, by the way. That they may all be one, just as you, Father, are in me, and I in you, that they may also be in us, so that the world may believe that you have sent me. By the way, it's our unity with one another, our love with one another that demonstrates to the world that Jesus exists, that he was. The glory that you have given me, I have given them. Wow. That they may be one, even as we are one. I in them and you in me. That they may become perfectly one, so that the world may know that you sent me and loved them even as I love you. Now, many times in this passage is appealing to as a teaching on the unity of the church. Christ is praying that his followers would be so united, so unified, that the world would see that they are indeed followers of Jesus. But even more fundamentally, this is a prayer for the unity of the believer with God the Father and God the Son. Verse 21 says, that they may be one even as we are one. I in them and you in me, that they may become perfectly one. This is, if Jesus himself didn't pray this, it would almost be hard to believe that he's praying that we would be unified with each other and with him as much as he is unified with the Father. So the fundamental union here is not the union among believers, so to speak, rather the union between God the Father and God the Son and us. As the Father is in the Son and the Son is in us, we are then in God the Father and in God the Son. There's a unity between the believer and the Godhead that comes through knowing Christ. Through knowing Jesus, we are unified with God. Again, we often read through a lot of these things and we skip through them so quickly. But to park on that for a minute, that we are unified with the almighty, all-knowing, all-powerful, eternal creator of the universe. Finally, let's look at the Gospel of Luke. Luke 10, verse 16. Luke chapter 10, verse 16. The one who hears you hears me, and the one who rejects you rejects me. This is Jesus talking to his disciples. And the one who rejects me rejects him who sent me. Here again we see the unity of the believer with Jesus, and then Jesus with the Father. So that the person who rejects the preaching of the disciples is said to have rejected Jesus. It's not just the disciples that he rejects Jesus because Jesus is so intimately united with his disciples. And he who rejects Jesus rejects God because God the Father is so intimately one with Jesus. So in this passage, we see the mystical union of the believer with Christ and the Father, and we are identified with Christ and personally related to him, which is, when you think of it, that someone rejects your teaching about God, they're rejecting God himself by rejecting you. So in the Gospels, we have many different examples of this sort of union. We won't look at them all, but in the Gospels, Jesus will say, I am the light of the world. But then he says to the disciples, you are the light of the world. In as much as they are united with Christ, who is the light of the world, we also are the light of the world. We've seen the parable of the vine and the branches. The vine isn't something that is distinct or unattached from the branches. The branches are part of the vine. They are unified, identified with the vine. And then, of course, the example from Luke of how Christians are treated by the world is them treating Christ that way. Jesus said even, anyone who gives a cup of cold water to one of these little ones in my name gives it unto me. So these are various examples of our close identification with Christ, who we are in Christ. We'll pause there. Next week we'll go through Paul's letters. And how many are on the list? I can't remember. Is there 17? I don't know that we'll go through all of them. Yeah. I only have up to 12 in expanded notes with me. But there's over 50, I think, of times references. Well, actually, no, the references are more than that. But the different things that we are, who we are in Christ. Paul uses that phrase so often, in Christ. Any comments or questions on anything we talked about today? All right. We got some time for fellowship.